Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that warm welcome. I understand I now stand on the sacred ground of the Tar Heels. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be invited to this famous and distinguished university. And I have enjoyed enormously over the past years getting to know many students and professors in North America. And you encourage me to see so many of you come to hear a talk on the question, God, fact or fiction. And I presume you mean by the title the question as to whether there's any objective reality to God, or whether the concept of God is, just as was suggested in the film, a construct of our human minds. And I suppose that's probably the best place to start, with Sigmund Freud, who suggested that God, the idea of God, is a wish fulfillment in order to compensate us for the miseries of this life, pie in the sky when you die. It's very interesting when you analyze that kind of argument, because it actually works both ways. And there is a book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the great one, written by Germany's most distinguished psychiatrist, Manfred Lutz. And in that he says, if there is no God, then of course Freud gives you a brilliant argument why religion and God are a wish fulfillment, if there is no God. But then he goes on to point out that if there is a God, Freud will give you an equally convincing argument why atheism is a wish fulfillment. The desire not to meet God. As Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel Prize-winning prize winner for literature, pointed out, that atheism for him was the opium of the people, satisfying the desire never to have to face God and to give account for our lives. So Manfred Lutz says the argument is equal in both directions at that level, and that psychiatry, neither Freud nor Jung nor Frankl, can help you with the question whether there is a God or not. And so when Richard Dawkins wrote the book, The God Delusion, I think it's important to realize that we've got to look at the evidence. And what I want to do is to present to you some of the evidence that has helped me on my pathway. Indeed, you may regard me as a prize candidate for delusion, because I come from Northern Ireland, which hasn't always the best reputation for its brand of Christianity. And when I arrived at Cambridge somewhere in the middle of last century, one of the first students I met started up a little conversation with me, and he said, tell me, do you believe in God? And then he said, oh, sorry, that's the last question I should have asked you. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it. Now, I'd heard that before, but it struck me. My parents were believers in God, so were their parents. So obviously it's something to do with Irish genetics and the Irish psyche. So of course I believed in God. So what I decided to do on that day, many, many years ago, was to get to know people who did not share my worldview, and I've been doing it ever since. As a result of that quest, that interest in truth, I learned German. I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, mixing with people that had been systematically exposed to atheism in their schools and universities. And then, having been a Russian translator most of my life, when the wall fell, I went to Russia, to Siberia, on a two-way ticket, mind you. But I got to Siberia and was involved in discussions in the Academy of Sciences with people who, for 75 years, had known nothing but the atheistic interpretation of the universe. I did that, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm interested in truth. The motto of your university is lux at libertas, light and freedom. And I was very fortunate when I was young in that my parents gave me light, but they gave me something very important. They gave me freedom to think. It is an unusual thing to come, as I do, from a sectarian country and have parents who are Christian without being sectarian. It's even more unusual to have parents that allow you to think and stimulate your imagination. And so those two words, lux and libertas, are very important to me. Indeed, I go to a university, of which you may have heard, somewhere away there in England, and its motto is Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my light. Now, it's very interesting this, you see, because both of our mottos, they're very similar. They come actually from the Christian tradition. So the people that founded your university and the people that founded my university did not see any conflict between believing in God and being involved at the highest and deepest level in intellectual activity. History is enormously important. And of course, as a scientist, I find it highly ironical that people pit God against science so much in the contemporary world. Because one of the first arguments I want to advance tonight is this, that modern science as we know it arose in a Christian context, in a monotheistic context. Merton, or Whitehead's thesis as it's known, best stated in the form in which C.S. Lewis put it. Men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. And it is not an accident that Galileo and Newton and Kepler and Clerk Maxwell and so on were all believers in God. Ladies and gentlemen, we forget very easily that far from belief in God hindering science, it was the very motor that drove it. So the negative of that is important because, as Richard Dawkins said to me once in a debate, that isn't a big deal because everybody believed in God in those days. And so if science is going to rise at all, then it's likely to arise in that kind of background. But that's not quite the whole story, because Joseph Needham, who was a chemist, a brilliant chemist at Oxford and a sinologist, an expert in China and Chinese, wrote the definitive history of technology and science in China. He was a Marxist, and he tried for many years to fit the lack of rise of modern science in China. They had technology, they had printing, they had fireworks and all sorts of things. But the notion of science as an abstract study with mathematics investigating the universe didn't happen. And he came to the following conclusion. He ended up not being able to fit it into Marxist principles. And he said the reason science did not rise in China in the way it did in the West is the fact that the Chinese lacked the unifying concept of a creator. So far from being embarrassed by being a Christian, believing that God is real and not a fiction, and a scientist, it's exactly the other way round in my case, because it is the Christian faith that arguably gave me my subject. Now, of course, you will object to that and say, but that doesn't really go to the question whether science has made Christianity obsolete. Surely science is the source of all the really big answers. Look at the success, say, of the Human Genome Project and so on. Well, I'm passionate about science, and science has given us many important answers to the questions that science can answer. But I don't think you at this university believe that science answers every question. Otherwise, you'd have to shut half your faculties. History would go, economics would go, philosophy would go, literature would go. And I don't think you want that. But it's important to realize that the success of science is partly because of the grid of its questions, the mesh of the net that it applies to catch the kind of knowledge that it itself gains. Science doesn't answer questions of ethics, for instance. Einstein once said, you can speak about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak about the scientific foundations of ethics. Nor does science deal with the question of meaning. And that's why some people who've put all their money on science are confused about the meaning of life, because science doesn't really go there. Indeed, recent research in psychiatry is absolutely fascinating. I listened in London just recently to Ian McGilchrist describing the results of a lifetime's work on the two halves of the brain. And his analysis goes like this, and it's being picked up by philosophers all around the world at the moment. You probably know the rudiments of it already. The left side of the brain is analytical. It's the scientific side. It's reductionistic. It analyzes, it measures, it counts. But there's a right-hand side to the brain. And the right-hand side of the brain integrates. It wants to see the big picture. It's interested in persons rather than things. And McGilchrist's thesis is this. He says, since the Enlightenment, we focused on the left side of the brain. But because we've got a right side to our brain, we've got utterly confused, because the left side, with its scientific analyses, is not giving us either transcendence or meaning. Now, I find that fascinating, because that's something that's actually flowing out of science. And he's arguing, as he takes us on a fascinating journey through the history of Western philosophy, he's arguing that we need to get back to those bigger pictures, the meta-narratives, the worldviews that give meaning, that integrate. And all of us in this room tonight and in the overflow, we all have a worldview. We've got our answers, not maybe completely formed. Our answers to the big questions of life. What is ultimate reality? What happens after death? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? And so on. We've all got a worldview. And it's important as we enter into this question, God, fact, or fiction, that we put it within a big picture so that we can see where we're all coming from. And it's simple, really, in a way. If you go back to the ancient Greeks, you'll find, as they looked at one of the fundamental worldview questions, and it's this: what is ultimate reality? And some people took the view that this universe is ultimate reality. Now they just change universe to multiverse. It is ultimate reality. Mass energy is all essentially that exists. Now see what follows from that. If you believe that, you are a materialist or a naturalist, and therefore your notion of what it means to explain things is bottom up. Because mass energy is all that exists, so you have to explain everything. The universe, you, your consciousness, your life, and you, bottom up. Now that worldview was popularized by Democritus and Leucippus and comes up to us through the centuries. But at the same time, there was another worldview espoused by Socrates, my intellectual hero, Plato, and Aristotle, and so on. And they said, no, mass energy isn't all that exists. There's something more. There's transcendence. There are the gods, or there is God. And so in the contemporary academy, we've got these two worldviews that collide together. They are, of course, diametrically opposed. Now, the interesting thing is this: when we ask the question, God, fact, or fiction, what we're really asking is this: if you attack that question, what tools have you got to answer the questions? And one of our tools is, of course, science and philosophy and our experience. And what complicates the whole process these days is the fact that people like Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss more recently, and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, they tend to present to us a choice between science and God. Now, when you think about that for a moment, that raises in my mind two different things. Firstly, it shows they're confused about God. What do I mean by that? Well, when you analyze what many of these people mean by God, it's not what I mean by God or what most people mean by God. They mean a God of the gaps, that God is a fiction invented to fill gaps that science or other intellectual activity has not yet filled. So as knowledge increases, God disappears. if you believe in a God of the gaps, by definition, you have to choose between God and science, because the more God, the less science, the more science, the less God. The God of the gaps philosophy is summed up in these words: I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, that is not the view of any of the three great monotheistic religions, certainly not of the Christian faith. Because I believe that God is not a God of the gaps, he's the God of the whole show. He's the God of the bits we understand, and he's the God of the bits we don't understand. We can illustrate that historically. When Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, look, I've got a law, I don't need God. No, he didn't. He wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science, Principia Mathematica, arguing, hoping that an intelligent person would see that it would lead them to believe in an intelligent God. In other words, the more he understood of the universe out there, the more he admired the genius of the God that had done it that way. And a moment's thought shows you that life is like that. The more you understand about art, the more you can see the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso. The more you understand about engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls or a Royce or a Whittle. It's not the other way round. So this idea of pitching God against science comes from a totally inadequate view of God, but it comes from somewhere else. And it's this: choosing between God and science is like choosing between Frank Whittle and science as an explanation for the jet engine. You'd never dream of doing that. Because in order to explain a jet engine, you need several things. You need a scientific explanation in terms of law of turbojet generation, and also of mechanical engineering. That's the science explanation. But you also need an agent explanation in terms of the man who designed the jet engine. You need both. Now, it's as silly to say that because we've got scientific explanations of bits of the universe, that rules out God as a fiction. It's as silly to say, aha, I understand how a Ford motor car works. I think Henry Ford is a fiction. It's exactly the same argument. And yet so many people fall for it. This business of explanation is something that's worth doing a little bit of research into, ladies and gentlemen. Because there's another thing I want to say. Do you think that when we get a law of gravity, we know what gravity is? We don't, you know. Wittgenstein, the famous philosopher, pointed out the greatest deception of modernism is to think that the laws of nature are explanations. Newton was clever enough to see that his law of gravity didn't explain what gravity was. Nobody knows what it is. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman, one of the most distinguished American Nobel-winning physicists that ever existed. You see, even science itself is limited. What does it mean to explain? The point I'm making is that God is not a fiction invented to explain where science cannot explain. God is the one who created the universe and is the reason why science itself can be done. And we'll come to that in a little while. So I want to make clear also that the big issue facing us is not science versus religion. That ought to be clear to you. I mentioned the Human Genome Project a moment ago. Its first director was Jim Watson, who won the Nobel Prize. Its second director was Francis Collins, now the director of the National Institute of Health. Watson's an atheist. Collins is a Christian. I've met both of them and discussed this with them. What divides them is not their science. They're both top-level scientists. What divides them is their worldview. One is an atheist, and the other is a theist, a Christian. So what I'd like to get across tonight is this. When we're facing the question on the table, we're really asking, what is the evidence for one worldview or the other? Now, there's so much argument today from the side of the new atheists. And as you heard in the introduction, I've debated most of them. And it's been a very interesting experience. And the result of those debates has been that I concentrate, as I've just done, on some of the arguments that I think are very important in clearing the fog away so that we can see what it is we are really talking about. Now, the next question is this: how do we decide whether God is a fiction or not? Well, the first thing to do is to realize that it is a matter of evidence. Well, some people say, is it really? I thought science was facts, and you religious people, you believe in faith. Well, that is totally wrong. You see, I wouldn't stand here for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, if I did not believe that there was evidence for my faith. But because there has been a redefinition of faith in the last 10 years, I'd better explain to you what is going on. If you look up Webster's dictionary as distinct from the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find a new entry under faith. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. The Oxford English Dictionary hasn't got there yet, but many people in England have got there. That is not the definition of faith. Faith, fides in Latin, means trust, belief, and always has the idea of raising the question, what is the evidence on which your trust rests? If I asked you, were the Tar Heels going to win all their games this season? I might then ask you, what's the evidence of it? And I think you'd be very quick to give me an awful lot, wouldn't you? Of course you would, because all of you understand what evidence-based trust means. Every one of us do. The financial crisis proves it. We thought we could trust the bankers, or at least some of them, and they let us down, and the whole market froze because there wasn't, as you economists know, enough grounds for trust, so the evidence had to be built up. There's not a person in the West these days that doesn't know what evidence-based trust means. But unfortunately, the new atheists led by Richard Dawkins have come along and they've said, look, faith is a religious word, and it means believing where there's no evidence. So if you meet somebody like me, Professor Lennox, he's a man of faith. That's not a compliment, that's an insult. It means Lennox believes where there's no evidence, so there's no point in talking to him. Now, I cannot speak for other faiths tonight. They must rightly speak for themselves. But it must be something that we emphasize, that the Christian faith is evidence-based. That is seen in many places in the New Testament. But one in particular, there are 4 Gospels. The 4th one, the Gospel of John, ends with these words. Many other things Jesus did in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. Many things he did, not written. These are written in order that you might believe. That is, that faith is a commitment based on evidence. The next step that's very important is to realize that faith is an essential ingredient in science. Albert Einstein said that I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. What faith? Well, not faith in God, but faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. You see, I'm a scientist. I believe, I have faith, I have confidence in the fact that science can be done. That's part of my credo. But what justifies that faith? I mean, is it not astonishing that a mathematician thinking with her head in here can come up with equations that describe the universe out there? That prompted Eugene Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, to say that mathematics is unreasonably effective. How does it work? Why do scientists trust in the rational intelligibility of the universe? Now, this is something that has been put under quite a bit of scrutiny in recent days. Because, you know, Charles Darwin wrote very many interesting things, but one of them was this. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Our topic is God, fact or fiction. But let's have a look. Is science fact or fiction? Well, you say, what do you mean? Well, let me think it out with you. I am a scientist who trusts my mind to access the universe out there. On what basis? Well, when I talk to my atheist friends in Oxford, and I have many of them, and I talk to them all the time, I ask them, tell me, what is the mind? Well, they say the mind is the brain. They are reductionist. And what's the brain? Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, a natural process that gets us from primitive chemicals to consciousness. Oh, I see. That's very interesting. Why do you trust it then? This is Darwin's doubt. You see, if you go to your desk tomorrow morning and you have a look at your computer and you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it? Of course you wouldn't. You wouldn't trust it for a moment. Now, this is what I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen. Is science fact or fiction? If it is generated by an instrument that is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, that sounds pretty like a big fiction to me, except we wouldn't know what fiction or any words meant if that were true. Because rationality dissolves, as is increasingly seen. Read, for instance, the book by Thomas Nagel that's just come out last week. And Thomas Nagel is a leading American philosopher and an atheist. It's called Mind and Cosmos. And he's pointing out what has been pointed out over several years, that there's a massive problem with the naturalistic interpretation of the universe because it reduces thought to the firing of synapses. It's like you saying, this painting is nothing but molecules of paint and canvas. That's the end of meaning. So the title becomes a very interesting one. We started with God, fact or fiction, but now I'm saying this. If you remove God, you end up with science being a fiction. One of Germany's leading philosophers is Robert Spemann, and he said, if you exit God, you exit any concept of access to truth, even via science. So you see, what I'm doing is what I did at the very beginning with the Freud argument. I'm applying it in two directions. Now, from where I sit as a Christian, the rational intelligibility of the universe fits beautifully with what Christianity teaches. Because what it teaches is that the very same God is responsible for the universe out there as is ultimately responsible for the human mind in here. That at least has the benefit of making some sense. So we move on from there because many questions now flood in, and people say, but just a minute. All this talk about science and God is okay, but you know, you Christians have another thing that you claim to believe in. You claim to believe in revelation. You believe in holy books, and surely there's an example, if ever there was one, of faith being opposed to rationality, reason, and science. No, it isn't. Not at all. I confess to you, without any embarrassment, I do believe that the Scripture, the Bible, is a revelation from God. But then it seems to me that that fits with my other experience. If there is a God, ladies and gentlemen, he's hardly likely to be less than we are. He's likely to be a great deal more than we are. And if there is a God who's a personal God, then the notion that he has revealed himself is a notion that lies very readily to hand. And you will be aware that the central claim of Christianity is that God became human. He revealed himself in human form. But revelation, let's start at this level. Revelation is not opposed to reason. If you want to get to know me and I remain silent, you'll never get to know me, even if you put me under a scanning, tunneling microscope and attach electroencephalographic equipment to my brain. You'll never get to know me. But you will get to know me if I reveal myself to you. That is, if I start speaking. Now tell me, when I start speaking to reveal myself to you, do you switch your brain off? Of course not. You need your brain, your mind, to understand what I'm saying. So what I claim, ladies and gentlemen, is this, that there are different sources of information for us. There is nature. We study it with great fascination. There is literature. There is art. There is music. But there's also revelation, at least something that claims to be revelation. We use our minds on all of them. I haven't yet met anybody that can read the Bible without using their mind. So it is absurd to suggest that revelation and reason are opposed. But I know, because I can hear it, what will come into this immediately. It's the notion, but look, revelation means that there's a supernature. And surely we realize, have you been asleep for the last 3 centuries? Don't you realize that David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, has proved that miracles are impossible? So it's stupid talking to us in this distinguished university about the supernatural and the miracles. Who do you think we are? Well, that's what I got in the Charlie Rose show 2 or 3 weeks ago. You've probably heard of Charlie Rose, have you? Well, I was flown over to New York to meet Richard Dawkins on the Charlie Rose show. And Richard Dawkins started this little discussion that lasted a whole hour by saying this. He said, of course, I've met John Lennox. And John Lennox, believe it or not, he actually believes that Jesus walked on water. Wow. In other words, to say that he's an absolute idiot and should not be a professor at Oxford. My response was, Richard, I said, if Jesus was who he claimed to be, the Word of God incarnate, the one that created the universe and therefore invented water, walking on it isn't a big deal. Your problem is this. You have an a priori rejection of the supernatural. That's what we need to talk about. We don't start with the miracles of Jesus. Because if you reject the supernatural a priori, of course you reject them and think I'm idiotic. But there are, in principle, questions to ask before we get that far. So I proceeded. And it's interesting because this happened with Christopher Hitchens at one of my debates. He brought up David Hume. David Hume says miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And therefore, since we know the laws of nature, people in the biblical times were crude and pre-scientific. They could believe in miracles. That is impossible to us. Well, both wrong. First of all, why was it that when Jesus rose from the dead, it was recognized as a miracle? Because people knew the law that dead bodies stay dead. They weren't that primitive. Why was it that Joseph, when Mary told him she was pregnant, didn't believe her story about the Holy Spirit? Was that because he didn't know where babies come from? No, it was because he knew where they came from. You see, the people then knew those laws of nature because, think about it for a second, if you don't know the regularities, you couldn't recognize something that appears to be an exception, could you? So that's the first question dealt with. The second one is much more serious. Are miracles violations of the laws of nature? I'm staying in a hotel tonight. I'll not name it. But I'm staying in a hotel. Now, imagine tonight I put $100 in the drawer by my bed. And tomorrow night I put another $100. So the 100 plus 100 is 200, even in Chapel Hill, yes? You're not totally postmodern. You believe in some truth, okay? So 100 plus 100 equals 200. So I stay another night, I go into the drawer and I find $50. So what do I say? Do I say A, the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or do I say B, the laws of North Carolina have been broken? Well, you know the answer, don't you? But isn't that very interesting? How do you know the laws of North Carolina have been broken? How do you know a thief has put his hand in? You know it because you know the laws of arithmetic. That's why you laughed. If somebody was sitting here and didn't know arithmetic, they'd have said, well, 100 plus 100 is 200 yesterday, and today it's 50. Well, that's very interesting. So what? Now, let's look at that a bit more carefully. What are these laws? They're descriptions of what normally happens. The laws of Newton will describe how a snooker ball moves on a table. They won't cause it to move. Do you know the laws of Newton never caused a snooker ball to move in the whole history of the universe? Laws are not causes, they're descriptions of what normally happens. Now, God, who invented the universe with its regularities, of course can feed a new event in. The laws take over. So when God encoded himself into humanity in Jesus Christ at that conception, 9 months later, according to what you learn in med school here, 9 months later a baby was born. The laws took over. The miracle occurred at the beginning. But you see, and this is so important, miracles don't violate any laws. The laws describe what normally happens, but the God that invented the universe and created its regularities can feed a new event in. Just as much as Newton's laws will describe the billiard ball going across the table, but if I lean over the table and pick the ball up as it goes across, I'm not breaking Newton's laws because I am entering into that system which isn't closed with a new energy. Do you see what's going on here? And God does exactly the same thing. You see, Christians are not claiming that Christ rose from the dead by some natural process going on in the grave 5 minutes before he rose. That would be breaking the laws, the law that dead bodies remain dead. What they are claiming is that God injected his power and raised him from the dead as powerful evidence that he is who he claimed to be. So it seems to me that arguing that miracles violate the laws of nature is just false. And incidentally, one of the greatest supporters of David Hume was the late Antony Flew. He, in fact, was the world's most famous atheist before Richard Dawkins. And not long before he died, I had an opportunity to spend a couple of hours chatting to him. And I took the liberty of asking him about his books on Hume. And he said, I was wrong about Hume. My books would all have to be rewritten. Because Antony Flew came to believe in God. He became a deist, not a Christian. He came to believe in God. And the interesting thing is, the springboard of his belief was the nature of the complexity of human DNA. Now, this is very interesting. He said to me explicitly, but it's written elsewhere, that he was simply wrong in thinking that Hume had actually given the final solution to the problem of miracles. He had done no such thing. This universe, ladies and gentlemen, according to the materialists, is a closed system. I think the evidence goes to show it's an open system. And that there is a God who has left his fingerprints within space and time. Now, often when I talk about this kind of thing, all kinds of objections come, and one of them is, look, isn't there an aspect of your faith that is, well, it's pretty weak stuff, you know. You talk about God being 3 in 1, and you talk about there being a creator, but look, if you're going to say that God created the universe, well, you're going to logically ask who created the creator. That question appeared twice on the board outside, didn't it? Richard Dawkins centers his whole book, The God Delusion, around that question. So let's have a look at it for a minute, because I find in universities around the world it creates a problem. The first thing is the incomprehensibility of Christianity, and the second, who created the creator. But it's easier for me to look at them the other way round. So let's take the who created the creator first. I hope it's not too late at night for logic. I love logic. And I hope you love logic. So, Who or what created X? What do those words mean? And what do they presuppose? What created X presupposes that X was created, yes? This is what philosophers call a complex question. Because in the asking of the question, there's a closing down on the possible answers, often to make the real answer look absurd. Because you don't realize that the question limits the answer. Who created God assumes God's created. Now, you'll have noticed that what the title of Richard Dawkins' book is not. It's not the created God's delusion. Because we don't need him to tell us that created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols. You see, he is assuming that God is created. But what if God isn't created? As Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all very strongly affirm. That God is eternal. The question bypasses it completely. But there's a sting, as I pointed out to Dawkins. I said, you think it's a valid question about my God. Of course it isn't, because the God revealed in Scripture is eternal. In the beginning, the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word was God. That is, already was. He is eternal. All things came to be through him. And at that point, John is pointing out to the great Greek question. Are there eternal things, or did everything come to exist? And the claim of John is this: God is eternal. He never came to be. The rest of the universe came to be. Okay? So I said to Richard, let's turn the question round. You believe the universe created you. You also believe this is a valid question, so let me put it to you. Who created your creator? I'm still waiting for the answer. You see, it works both ways. So this question that he regards as a knockdown question that ends God completely is no such thing. The second one was about the incomprehensibility of God. The idea of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, I can't give you a lecture on that. I'll tell you a story. I once addressed a room as full as this of physicists, all engaged in research on atomic weapons and atomic physics. And after I'd finished, a professor from Oxford came up to me and he said, well, he said, Dr. Lennox, that was a very interesting talk, about science and religion. But I detect that you're a Christian. He was pretty sharp, you see. I detect you're a Christian. And he said, now come off it. I mean to say, Christianity's absurd. All this wonderful philosophy recognizing God in the design of the universe, I can see there's something in that. But I mean to say, I'm surprised at you, really. Because you see, aren't you obliged to believe that Jesus is both human and God at the same time? I said, absolutely. He said, can you explain that to me? And I said, well, why not? But I said, before I do, let me ask you something simpler. He said, that's fine, that's fair. I've asked you a question, you asked me one. So I said to him, what is consciousness? He said, I don't know. Oh, I said, that's all right. Let's try something easier. What is energy? Well, we can measure it and we can use it. I said, what is it? A longer pause. I don't know. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. Tell me, do you believe in consciousness? Yes, he said, I do. And do you believe in energy? Yes, he said, I do. And you don't know what either of them are. Should I write you off as a physicist? He said, please don't. But I said, you were about to write me off as an intellectual, because I couldn't explain to you how Jesus is simultaneously God and man. I said, look, we don't even know what light is, gravity is, energy is. We realize that light sometimes looks like particles, sometimes looks like waves. We've got models to cope with it. But I said, why is it you believe in these things when you don't know what they are? Being a kind Irishman, I helped him out of it. And I said, I think you believe in them because of the explanatory power of the concepts. He said, that's right. Well, I said, that's exactly why I believe that Jesus is both God and human, because it's the only explanation that makes sense of the data. There is mystery, but ladies and gentlemen, the mystery is spread. There is mystery in my Christian faith, marvelous mystery. And there's mystery in science, and I'm trying to explore both. We mustn't come off with the idea that the only incomprehensible things are in, say, the Christian faith. If there is a God, he's going to be a lot more complex than we might imagine. Toy cars aren't complex, but they're boring. You'd rather have a real Porsche or a real NASCAR, and that's much more complicated, isn't it? Oh, says Richard Dawkins, but there's the next problem, you see. You Christians are hopeless because you bring in God as an explanation. Okay, let's just talk about that matter of complexity. Isn't your God absolutely useless as an explanation because he's more complex than the thing you're explaining? That's no explanation. Because explanation by definition runs from the simple to the complex. Does it? So Richard Dawkins put that to me in a debate. And I said to him, well, that's a very interesting objection, Richard. You know, I read a book not long ago called The God Delusion. And it's about 400 pages long. It's pretty complex. So I thought I would ask myself the question what its origin was. And then I discovered to my amazement that its origin was in the much more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I completely dismissed that because it was no explanation. Because the mind of Richard Dawkins is more complex than the thing I'm trying to explain. It's a rather foolish argument, isn't it? And ladies and gentlemen, where do we get the idea from? That explanation always goes from the simple to the complex. It's wonderful when we can explain complex things in terms of simple. But there's one area where we never do it. And that one area is in the field of semiotics and language. The moment you saw the words, "Is God real?" come up there, you recognized them, didn't you? Now let me tell you a little story to explain this. We have lovely dinners in my college. I'm sorry I can't invite you to one of them, but there we are. And one night I was having dinner with a biochemist, brilliant biochemist. And when he discovered I was a mathematician, he was really upset. And when he discovered further that I was interested in these big questions, he was even more upset. And he said, we're going to have a rotten evening because I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, and I'm not interested. And we're going to have a horrible time, which is not the best way to start a dinner. So I've told this story many times because I find it illustrates this best of all. So forgive me if you've heard it before. So I said, you're a reductionist. I take it you're an ontological reductionist. You believe everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. He said, that's right. So I picked up the menu from the table. I said, let's do an experiment. He said, what, here? I said, yes. Let's have a look at this. And it said roast, R-O-A-S-T, chicken. So he said, what's the problem? Well, I said, you're a reductionist. Everything can be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. He said, that's right. So I said, explain to me the semiotics of the letters R-O-A-S-T, the way they carry meaning, in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife was sitting beside him, and rather too loudly she said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. His answer was stunning. He said this, John, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory thinking this could be done. And many brilliant people still think it can be done, ladies and gentlemen. But he says it can't be done. And I said, half a minute. I started to play devil's advocate. Physics and chemistry have only been going for 500 years or so. Oh no, he said, it can't be done. It needs the input of an intelligence. And it's not an intelligence of the gaps either. It's that the nature of the thing being studied demands an intelligent input. And he was amazed that I could come up with such an idea. He said, where did you get that idea? I said, I confess, I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. Oh, he said, that's a relief. But this is very important, ladies and gentlemen. Reductionism of the methodological kind, and indeed an ontological kind, is very important in the natural sciences. But there's one area, massive area, where it doesn't work. And that's where you've got semiotics and meaning. You infer upwards. The moment you see a word, you infer upwards to an intelligence, no matter how many and how automatic and how pre-programmed are the processes that get that word before your eyes. And it only takes 5 letters of roast chicken. Now here's the rub. You and I have lived to see the discovery of the longest word in existence. It's the human genome. 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order in a 4-letter chemical alphabet. The very same people, I discover, that immediately infer intelligence from 4 or 5 letters of their own name or a word, can look at the human genome and say, when you ask them its origin, chance and necessity. What? Chance and the laws of nature? Something very strange is going on. Now, I haven't time to argue with you why I think theoretical computer science supports my conclusion that you do not get word, meaningful word, by unguided natural processes. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it's not simply the miracles of Jesus that are evidence of the supernatural, though they are, and they're very important. It starts much earlier on. As I said to Richard Dawkins, your very rationality is evidence of the supernatural. Because if you provide a causal reason, cause and effect for your rationality, you empty it of meaning on the same basis that many people say to me, you say that because you're an Irishman. That empties it of meaning, as you know. You give a causal explanation, you remove the meaning. Now, I'll close with this and then we'll face the questions. 2 worldviews that we face in Chapel Hill, in Oxford, and around the world. One starts with mass energy and it ends up with consciousness and the human mind being derivative. The other starts, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through Him. That is, Word is primary, information is primary, God is primary, and mass energy are derivative, and your mind and mine are derivative. So there are the 2 possibilities. The first view regards God as a fiction, because God is the end product of this series. The universe has invented us and we have invented God. The other view, which starts with the Word, is that God invented the universe and He is the ultimate reality. And all I can say, ladies and gentlemen, it is both as a scientist and a Christian that it's the Word explanation that makes infinitely more sense to me. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If God is real, why is there suffering in the world? The second one is, why do people use something as personal as religion to hurt others? And finally, aren't all religions equal?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do, I have noted these questions, but he's removed them, so I don't know what they are anymore. But before I look at them, I want to get some idea of the questions you've got. Now, this is a Q&A, and you will rapidly discover my limitations. Because in a Q&A, by definition, you can only say a little bit of how you would approach a given question. So what I'm going to ask you to do is this. I find in audiences that everybody is interested in other people's questions. And so keep your questions short and on the topic. I'm not here to answer questions about health care or anything else like that. I'm here to try to address this topic. So what I'm going to invite you to do is come up to the microphone, state your question. I'm going to write down a number of questions alternately from the microphone, take them with those 3, and then we'll see where we go from there. So Whoever's got a question, just line up here and state your question briefly, and I will write it down. Just remember, the time you take for your question is time taken away from somebody else. Okay, off we go. Don't all rush at once.
Okay.
Okay, just start and slowly and clearly so as we all hear you.
Okay. I read a book about the God part of the brain, stating that part of the mind is dedicated to religion. Some people have a stronger part than others. And an example of this would be somebody who is a God-believing Christian fell, and then after that was unable to believe. What would be your response to that?
Thank you. Okay, over there.
Many theists believe that their sense of morality is derived from their religion, and I've also heard that you can't take the Bible literally, so you have to pick and choose which parts you take as your sense of right and wrong. And my question is, how do you do that? Like, on what basis do you do that? If the basis is subjective, then that means you'd have to derive your sense of right and wrong from somewhere other than the Bible, which means that the Bible really isn't really where you derive your sense of morality.
Okay, thank you. 3.
Do you believe in a young or a old earth?
Have you all understood the question?
Never mind, that was going to be my exact question.
Do I believe in a young or old earth? Not quite sure what that's got to do with the topic, but I'll put it down. Next.
Yes. What do you say to many scholars who believe that certain Christian doctrines, such as bodily resurrection and the Last Judgment, were taken more or less wholesale from other religions like Zoroastrianism?
This relates back to the New Old.
Hey, just hang on a minute. Okay.
To your comment about the New Earth, Old Earth question, it was the same one, but to, I guess, point out like how, at least I took it as on topic. You were talking about how science and religion don't have to be diametrically opposed, but I was wondering, if you do take the New and Old Testament as literal, do you believe that the Earth is approximately 6,000 years old? And if so, how do you reconcile that with all the evidence against that?
Next.
Why Christianity?
Okay. Well, that was short. Anything else?
How do you rationalize evolution within the context of your faith?
How do I rationalize it? Do you think I do? Okay. Yes.
This one has to do with your field of mathematics. As created beings in the likeness of God, giving the ability to create also, is mathematics just observable, or do we have the opportunity to create new mathematics?
Thank you. Well, that'll have to do, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. How very interesting. So we'll take the last one first, since I'm a mathematician. It's a very interesting question. People have puzzled about it for centuries, of course. Is mathematics discovered or is it created? And probably because I'm an Irishman, I think both, actually. Because God himself has clearly the designer of the regularities in the universe. We really are discovering something out there. You'll notice that very few scientists are postmodern in their science. They may be postmodern in their morality, but they're not postmodern in their science. They believe mostly in a kind of critical realism. We're approximating to the truth, but never getting quite to it. And staggering things have been found out. The Higgs boson and all the elementary particles and all of that kind of stuff seems to be out there. So we're discovering things. But human beings are made in the image of God. And God invented a universe, and so do we. Some of the most exciting bits of literature are human inventions. Indeed, a lot of literature is like that. And I had the good fortune, when I was at Cambridge, that the Mathematics Institute was just across the road from the Institute of English Language. And there was a man called C.S. Lewis still lecturing there. So I sneaked out when the mathematics got boring and went to listen to Lewis. And I'm very thankful for that because he educated my imagination. And I'm sure there are many people here interested in creative writing and the media and so on. This is a marvelous gift of God to be able to create. Now, mathematics is interesting because some of it is directly geared to, let's find the mathematics that gears into what we call the real world. But people like me actually work in two kinds of worlds because we are trying to work out the consequences, the theoretical consequences of a set of axioms, whether or not they have any relevance in the real world. So it is in a way highly creative, but it has to be logically coherent. And of course, that's where it differs greatly from imaginative literature. So I think one of the wonderful things, indeed, I would regard it as an evidence of God's existence, is the fact that we can do science, we can do arts, we can do literature. And that is one of the most exciting things and motivating things I find. God is not dull and boring, you know. He invented all the colors, and we find it very difficult to invent new ones. So that'll have to be enough for that question. Now, the God part of the brain dedicated to religion. Now, this comes up again and again, but it seems to me, and I haven't recently investigated it, that it's dying a bit of a death because it is seen that many parts of the brain's interconnections are bewildering in their complexity. And this notion that one bit of the brain deals with one thing is just not true. In fact, what I said to you at the beginning of my lecture needs serious qualification, which I didn't give it. And that is, although there are differences between the left hand and the right hand side of the brain, both sides of the brain can do almost anything. And so this notion of identifying a God part with that particular part is a very questionable activity. But the questioner went on a bit and said that when parts of some people's brain get damaged, their behavior can change, and indeed their beliefs can change. And that is absolutely true. Sometimes, sadly, old people who've lived virtually blameless lives, something happens, the brain dries out or loses too many neurons, and they start to behave like children. Now, we need to be very careful here. And this is where I think the Christian faith is utterly glorious. Some people might look at those old people and say, what a pity. They used to be such nice people, but now they seem to have lost everything. Be careful. It just could be that there is damage physically affecting their neurophysiology. You know, if you give me a brand new Cadillac to drive, and watch me going along the road, you say, oh, he must be a very good driver. Whereas I see you in your 50-year-old VW Beetle, and it's careering around across the road, and I say, rotten driver. It may not be you, it may be the car. And one of the marvelous doctrines of Christianity is this, that if we trust Christ and build up our character and our beliefs and our trust in him, he promises not to lose it. Because death will occur anyway and will destroy us. But before we get to death, physically that is, we may exhibit all kinds of bizarre trends that would lead other people to think, gosh, that was a terrific Christian, or that was a tremendous atheist, and they lost their faith in both directions. But it may not be so, you see. It may simply be that now the degeneration of the body is causing neurophysiological changes that are causing mental changes. Now, of course, atheism has no hope for such people, because by definition, death is the end. But the wonderful thing about the Christian faith is, as Jesus said, when he saw a brother and sister in a graveyard centuries ago, and the sister was weeping, and he said to her, your brother will rise again. You had a relationship that was special to you. That will go on into the world to come. Atheism has nothing like that to offer us, ladies and gentlemen. And that brings me neatly to the question about the resurrection. Was it taken from other religions? No. And you can prove that from the Old Testament. There are myths about God's dying and rising again. But the special thing about resurrection is that's what it is. In Greek, anastasis, standing up again. When Paul, the Christian apostle, went to Athens, he was invited to speak to the philosopher's court, the Areopagus. And they listened to him very politely until he started talking about Jesus and the resurrection, and a ripple of laughter went round the court, which proves that they didn't accept resurrection. What they did accept, at least the Platonists, was survival of the soul. But that laughter is evidence that what Paul was preaching was something that none of them believed, was that a body put in the grave literally rose again. Now, saying there are analogies between God's dying and rising and Christ rising from the dead doesn't at all affect the point that I come to next. And that is, I believe in the resurrection because I think there's historical evidence for it. I don't see any historical evidence for those other claims, which are largely and admittedly part of mythology. But the resurrection, of course, is the central evidence for the deity of Christ. Now, how do I rationalize evolution within my faith? Do I believe in a young or old earth? Is the Bible literal? Now, we need to deal with some very simple things first, ladies and gentlemen. No one takes the Bible literally. Can I prove that to you? Jesus said, I am the door. What was he made of? Stone, metal, plastic? That's a metaphor. You see, the word literal is something we need to investigate. We use it without thinking. People constantly ask me, do you take the Bible literally? I say, what exactly do you mean? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's talking about the literal earth, base level, isn't it? And of course, the way we read language is, first of all, to take it at face value. But the face value may not be literalistic. Let me explain that to you. Jesus said, I am the door. How do you know he's not a door made of steel? Actually, it's because you know a bit of science. You know something about the real world. You know that's a metaphor, but watch it. That doesn't mean it isn't real. And it doesn't mean it isn't literal. Jesus is a real door. Literal, if you like, but at the next level up. That is, he is a real doorway into a real experience of God. I'd stake my life on that. Do you see the point I'm making? That this word literal is totally misleading. You know, sometimes when people say to me, do you take the Bible literally? I say to them, Israel was a land flowing with milk and honey. So when the Israelites came into the land, they met a great sticky ball of milk and honey coming crashing down the main street. Oh, no, you don't take it literally. You take it spiritually, don't you? Israel was a land full of the milk of the word and the honey of the Holy Spirit. You don't take it like that either. Israel was a land, literal. The milk and honey were literal. The metaphor is flowing. But it's describing a real situation, that this was a rich culture, agriculture, with lots of milk, lots of honey, lots of health. You see the point? Ladies and gentlemen, there is a great danger in treating the Bible as less than a book and imposing idiotic restraints on it that we'd never impose on any other piece of literature. So that's the first point. Point number 2 is this. Do I believe in a young or old earth? What does it matter whether I do or not? Suppose I say, I believe in a young earth, and you'll go away and say, Professor Lennox believes in the young earth, you know. And some of you will think that's marvelous, and some of you will think he's a consummate idiot. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there is a sense in which what I believe is not important. Why I believe it is very important. Now, the question before us, of course, is based on interpretations of the Bible. Do you know where they came from? The young earth view? My hometown in Ireland. I shouldn't have confessed that, should I? Archbishop Usher. Well, let me give just one little step in this direction. And then I'll have to do a bit of shameless advertising. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what Scripture says. I believe it. Ladies and gentlemen, let me make it absolutely clear. I am fully convinced of the inspiration and authority of Scripture. I take it very seriously. That is why I read it very carefully. You get then a sequence of days. If you notice those days, every one of them, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, begins with the phrase, "and God said." You would expect, since it is a sequence, that the first would begin with the phrase, "and God said." And you notice that that phrase first comes in verse 3. The Bible does not start with the words, "and God said, let there be a heavens and earth." Have you noticed that? The Bible starts with the words, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." It then gives you a sequence of days. And if you ask any Hebrew scholar, he will tell you, or she will tell you, that the tense changes from verse 3 on to indicate that the opening statement is in a sense independent and prior to the sequence of days. You see, we read it and we jump to the assumption, whatever we believe about the days, that the beginning was on day 1. Scripture doesn't say it. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth." It gives you a sequence of days, and as I say, the tenses indicate that the beginning is before the sequence of days. How long before? I haven't a notion. So if the Bible's not dogmatic, I'm not going to be. So now I come back to your question. Do I think the earth is old? Well, I think the evidence that as we have it is pretty overwhelmingly convincing that it's old. It doesn't affect a single thing in Scripture as far as I can see. That's how I'd start. How would I finish? Well, I've written a little book because I get asked this question endlessly. It was advertised at the beginning, so allow me to advertise it again. If you want to follow this up, and it is a really serious question for many people, because they want to take the Bible seriously, they want to take science seriously. Well, my little book is called 7 Days That Divide the World. And you might like to look at it. It's on Amazon, Kindle, and everything else. Now, how do I rationalize evolution within my faith? Well, of course, that assumes that I do. I don't attempt to rationalize evolution. I try to understand what it's claiming and decide whether the evidence favors it or not. And what I see is 2 things. I see that Darwin observed certain micro changes in the lengths of finch beaks in the Galapagos Islands, and he observed it. It happens. So I have no difficulty in believing that happens. But you're asking a mathematician, that's a very risky thing to do, because mathematicians have a massive track record of skepticism when it comes to evolution in the sense of mutation and natural selection being a creative force that actually is capable of increasing complexity and rising up the chain against the basic laws of theoretical computer science and so on. Now here again, I'm afraid I have to do a bit more shameless advertising, because my first book, God's Undertaker, A Science Buried God, is about this precise thing. So I only want to concentrate on the basic issue, ladies and gentlemen. If we understand evolution to be not those minor microevolutionary variations, but if we understand it to be increase in complexity by mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, and 1 or 2 other things, and if even more we understand it to be the origin of life, we need to make some serious distinctions. Evolution does not account for the origin of life by definition, because evolution assumes the existence of life before it can get going. It cannot therefore account for life. This is a massive confusion that has been perpetuated for years by Richard Dawkins, who says that the blind watchmaker is the explanation of the existence and variation of life. I'm glad that he now doesn't say that anymore. We've no idea from that perspective how life arose. But even at the level of the increasing complexity, I attend a systems biology seminar in Oxford because I'm very interested in these things, where they spend a lot of time questioning the adequacy of the neo-Darwinian synthesis, to such an extent that you're getting voices, some, not many, but I discussed them, or tried to, with Dawkins on the Charlie Rose show, some voices saying, like Lynn Margulis, presidential medal holder at the University of Massachusetts, plus professor at Oxford, Neo-Darwinism is dead. So I'm fascinated by what's going on. But to come to the biblical side for a moment, now let me go to those days and what is said about them. And God said, and God said, and God said. The corresponding statement is in the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word. There is a series of inputs of information from outside the system. That is a staggering claim because it's saying, one, the system isn't closed. Two, you do not get from stage N to stage N+1 without and God said. And you might notice there are 2 days in which God spoke more than once. On day 3, it's the difference between the non-living and the living. On day 6, it's the difference between animals and human beings. It's almost as if the text anticipates a contemporary debate. And God said, now I'm going to word myself very carefully. In Scripture, you do not get from the non-living to the living without and God said. Nor do you get from animals to human beings. Now there's a basis for a discussion. And ladies and gentlemen, the words and God said are the exact opposite of a mindless, unguided process. If you want to read any more of what I think, I'm afraid you'll have to look at my book. Now, I'll have to go quick. If you've got to catch a bus, you won't disturb me. But let's have a look at the rest of these questions briefly. There's a question of suffering. There's the question of suffering because of religious violence. And there's the question of why Christianity aren't all religions equal. Well, let's take the violence first. I come from Northern Ireland. I've seen religious violence. My family was affected by it. My brother was bombed. They put 300 stitches in his face because of religious violence. He nearly lost his life, and it damaged him psychologically. So I've seen religious violence. And when people ask me this question, they say, what do you think? There's your country, Catholics and Protestants fighting it out. Well, I say a number of things. Number one, it's not just a religious thing, but there's a religious element to it. But let's suppose it is a religious thing. What do I think about it? I'm ashamed of it. Utterly and totally ashamed of it. I'm ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with an AK-47 or a bomb. Why? Because Christ himself forbade it. Ladies and gentlemen, it is on historical record that Jesus was put on trial at the highest level in the province of the Roman Empire in which he lived by the Roman governor, Pilate. What was the accusation? Terrorism, to put it into modern language. He was accused of being a politically violent activist. So the accusation that Christopher Hitchens makes and Dawkins make against Christianity is the very same accusation that they made against Jesus and put him on trial. And what is Jesus' stance in all this? When one of his disciples took a sword, you remember, to defend him in the garden, he wasn't very well trained and he tried to cut the head of a chap and he just cut his ear off. And Jesus put the ear back on. I believe that actually happened. This is God incarnate. But I can't help seeing the lesson in it. If you take weapons to defend Christ or his message, you cut the ears off people. And many of my friends, I understand them. They can't even listen to the Christian message. Their ears have been cut off because they've gone around the world like Hitchens, seeing one religious war after another. And I said to him once, I said, Christopher, if you understood what Jesus really stood for, you'd be applauding him, you'd be on his side instead of against him. Because he was the one that said to the Roman governor, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting. And Pilate realized immediately he was no political threat. Kingdom not of this world? Of course it isn't. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the one thing you cannot do, well, listen to what Jesus said next. To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And Pilate, not cynically perhaps, said, what's truth? And he went out and said he's innocent. Truth, ladies and gentlemen, truth cannot be imposed by violence. Especially if it's truth about forgiveness, peace with God, eternal life, a knowledge of God. It can't be imposed by violence. So my reaction to this accusation is to say other religions must speak for themselves of this, of course. But as far as Christianity is concerned, people who take up weapons to defend Christ or his message are not following Christ, they're disobeying him. It is simply not Christian. And it cuts the ears off people, as I say. Of course, there's more to be said, ladies and gentlemen. Because the people that are loudest in their reasonable condemnation sometimes of religious violence forget that atheism has been the cause of the biggest bloodletting that we've seen in the last 20 centuries. You know, Richard Dawkins loves quoting the hymn, or no, it's not a hymn, it's a song by John Lennon. He didn't write any hymns, so far as I know. You remember John Lennon, imagine a world without religion, imagine a world without the Taliban, all that kind of thing. Well, I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox, and it makes a difference. And I've written a song, it's called Imagine. Imagine a world without Pol Pot. Imagine a world without Stalin. Imagine a world without Mao. What about that world? The new atheists are almost silent about it. And that silence is embarrassing because, ladies and gentlemen, if you count up all the people that died or tried to in so-called religious wars in the name of Christendom, not one of those deaths is justified. But when you put them beside the 100 million deaths in the 20th century, as a result of an atheist-inspired doctrine, they pale into insignificance. We need to treat both sides. The next question, and I rapidly go to the end, is if God is real, why is there suffering in the world? If you want to see a fuller answer to this, Google Veritas and Columbia University 9/11. Because on September the 11th this year, I did several things. I watched for several hours on the television as people read the names of their relatives who died in the Twin Towers. And as I watched, I became fascinated. And do you know what fascinated me? What fascinated me was this: there was no atheism. Secondly, there were many affirmations of Christian faith in the teeth of 9/11. Thirdly, everybody spoke about their relatives as if they were still alive. One of the most moving was a young girl who said, "Happy birthday, Mum." That tells us something, doesn't it? That in the face of that devastating event, the human spirit longs for hope and will not give up hope. That night I stood on the steps of the library in Columbia University with an audience this size in front of me, on the steps in the open air with the lights of the twin ground zero going up into heaven, and I tried to answer the question, the loud silence, where is God? Now you can see the whole talk if you want to in the Q&A that followed it. I only want to make a couple of points. This is the hardest question. A few years ago, I was within seconds of death because my heart, one of the arteries had closed completely, and the doctors saved my life and told me I should be dead. And people say to me, "Do you thank God for that?" I say, yes. But in that same year, my niece of 22 had an earthquake in her brain that killed her. Easy for me to say thank you, God, for that. What do I say to my sister, who lost her lovely girl at the age of 22? This question affects us all, ladies and gentlemen. I've no simplistic answers to it. And the only way I can approach it is to, well, open a window perhaps and leave it with you. And it's this. Atheism claims to have an answer. That's just the way the universe is. Richard Dawkins says there's no good, there's no evil. That's just the way it is. There's no justice. So atheism, by definition, is hopeless. Is that the way it is? Well, Richard says to me, because it's bleak, and it is bleak, that doesn't prove it's wrong, nor does it prove it's right. He thinks he solved the problem. That's just the way the universe is. So I have the problem because I still believe in God. Now, we can argue philosophically. Should a good God, could a good God not have done, if he was all-powerful, couldn't he have made a world in which there were no tragedies like this? Of course he could. He could have made us all pre-programmed robots, couldn't he? But then we wouldn't have been human. Because the thing that makes you special as a human being is the ability to say yes or no. That's what makes relationships special. I've been married for 44 years to the same person. What makes that special? Well, she freely chose me, believe it or not. I don't know why, but she did. I chose her. I know why. I saw her on day one at university, but that's another story. The relationship is special. Suppose I had a robotic wife. I hope to see her in 2 days' time. So I arrive at the house and she comes out and there's all the big screen that appears in front of her, you see. Kiss, press button 4. And I get a kiss. What use would that be? God could have made a world like that. But then there would have been no such thing as love. Of course, there would have been no hate. But as often been pointed out, if you're going to have a world in which relationship is possible, then you've got to have the capacity to say no and to say yes. That's where I start. And you say God took a terrific risk doing that, didn't he? Of course he did, and so will you when you have kids. I remember the first child that was born, holding this little girl in my hands and realizing I brought this girl into the world. She could grow up to reject me. Why did I have a little girl then? Why have children? Oh, aren't you glad you exist? That your parents took the risk? Because they reckon, well, yes, that is a theoretical possibility, but we trust that by loving our child and caring for them, that will never happen. It's a risk. So granted that God took a risk, the next question is, if the thing goes wrong, is there a solution big enough to deal with it? I was asked why Christianity. Here's the short answer. I'm a Christian, ladies and gentlemen, because at this level, Jesus doesn't compete with any other religion because no other religion offers me what he does. Let me try to explain that to you. We can argue to the end of time what a good God might, should, would have done, and we get nowhere. Why? Because in our hearts there's barbed wire, there's jagged edges, there are raw parts that leave some of us weeping inside even though we're not weeping outside. And the philosophy doesn't touch that. It's important, but it doesn't in the end touch that. So I ask another question. Granted that it's so, is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that would be big enough to allow me to trust God with the outcome? With the ragged edges, with the heartbreaks, with the unanswered questions. And I think there is, ladies and gentlemen. What's God doing in Christ on a cross? See, this is the heart of Christianity. It's utterly unique. Because the claim is that on that cross, Jesus is giving himself in my place for my sin, and he's creating a basis where I can know acceptance in this life. Nobody else offers me that. Generally speaking, religions offer me a path to stay on as best I can, and then there's a judgment and an assessment. And it's just like, well, the university here at Chapel Hill. You've exams to get in, you've exams to get out, and even the dearest professors can't guarantee that you're going to get out and pass. It's your merit. But the genius of what God has done is that salvation doesn't depend on merit. And I say to you tonight, and I'm not ashamed to, as a professor at Oxford even, Not that that's anything to do with it. That I'm certain of my relationship with God precisely because it doesn't depend on what I've done, but what Christ has done. And that suffering on the cross, ladies and gentlemen, shows me something more. It shows me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. And the more I live and the more I see the effect of people grasping that when they are suffering, the more it confirms to me that here we get to the heart of it, because the death was not the end. He rose from the dead. You see, what is atheism to say? The vast majority of people who've ever lived have suffered. Since the beginning of this lecture tonight, there are thousands of babies that have died in the most horrific conditions. What's atheism got to say about that? That's just the way it is. It is no hope. What have I to say about it? Well, precisely because I believe in a God of love, I firmly believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the character of God is such that if you saw what God did subsequently to children that have suffered as the result of other people's greed and everything else, your question would cease and you'd bow down and worship. That's a very big thing to say. But it is the thing that gives me magnificent hope. Is God fact or fiction? Atheism is the fiction, ladies and gentlemen. It is a hopeless philosophy. And I trust that during your time at this university, you will search out deep answers to your questions and not remain satisfied with some trivial explanation. How many people on that screen said they couldn't fit God into their philosophy? I could scarce believe it. If there is a God, it's us fitting into his philosophy and discovering the meaning of life by trusting him and living for him. It's been lovely to be with you. So I hope the Tar Heels do very well. Goodbye.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.